So hello everybody, and welcome back to people for who this isn't the first time you've attended one of these webinars with me. Don't know that we necessarily knew that we were going to be covering furlough again, but here we are. After covering the job support scheme only a few weeks ago, we're back on furlough again. And this time round, we're on what I'm calling the extended furlough scheme. Just an attempt to differentiate from the previous schemes that we've talked about. Although at the moment, the scheme's looking a bit like pretty much what we had back in August in the previous furlough scheme. So everybody who knows that I'll just switch off my camera. So I find myself distracting, but I'm still here. If you have any problems hearing me on the microphone or anything, do let me know. So far, I think everything seems to be working well. So just to run through what we're going to cover in this session, and as Lisa said, we're keeping it a bit shorter this time to try and give people more of a chance just to check in on, ask questions about anything that they've got. And if there is anything that you had that you didn't want to share, then by all means you can email me, and I can cover off quick questions around this if you wanted to make sure that it was something that you kept confidential. But essentially we're going to be covering off the eligibility of the new scheme and what the terms are. We're going to have a quick reminder for ourselves about what flexible furlough looks like. See if it might work for us this time round if you didn't use it previously. I'm going to cover an overview of employee rights during furlough. So I think we're all getting fairly comfortable now with the idea of furlough, and it's easy to forget almost. It's a temporary state of being, and we need to make sure that we're still meeting our commitments to staff, and we're still doing everything contractually that we should be doing, and we're not getting too relaxed with this feeling that everybody's happy with the level of flexibility that they've been offering us up until now, if they have. I'm going to chat over some alternatives to furlough just for you to have a think about. To be honest, this was originally based on the fact that furlough was only going to be extended for a month. So they might have been a bit different now that we're in this extended period of 5 months. And I'll set out some ideas for you to think about then in terms of planning ahead for possible next steps after furlough. I do a little bit of a refresher perhaps on business continuity planning. I'm always a fan about, we're in a particular place at the moment, what can we be doing to plan ahead for what things might look like in the future. Lot harder to do at the moment than it has been in previous years, but we'll cover off a bit of that. And then, as I said, an opportunity to ask questions at the end. And I've put in a little action plan as usual for you to take away as well. So looking at the eligibility and the terms of the extended scheme. So as we know, the original and amended scheme actually ran until the 31st of October. And the first announcement of the extended scheme is that it would run only until the 2nd of December. And we now know that it's going to run until the 31st of March next year. So big news if you missed it. I did first time round. It kind of hit me in the face yesterday when I was having a look at some stuff, was that the job retention bonus has been scrapped. So if you were planning and relying on that bonus that you might get in January if you retain staff, that's no longer being offered on the basis that, of course, the extended furlough scheme is being offered instead. Apparently, there will be some new job retention incentive announced at the appropriate time, whatever the appropriate time may be. So, as I said, in this scheme, we're kind of going back to what we had in August. So employees receive at least 80% of their salary for hours not worked, up to a maximum of £2,500. You as an employer are only responsible for national insurance and pension contributions. Although, of course, don't forget, you're also responsible for topping up for annual leave and for training, but we'll cover that. And we know that this is going to run to January 2021 in respect to the 80%. and that they're going to review the percentage then, and it might change for February and March. To be eligible for the extended scheme from November, individuals must have been on your PAYE payroll on the 30th of October this year. And in fact, you must also have made a real-time information submission to HMRC between the 20th of March 2020 and the 30th of October 2020, notifying a payment of earnings in order for those individuals to qualify. They can be on any type of contract, so they could be on a 0 hours, fixed term, a temporary contract, and they will still qualify. Again, a bit like first time round. Now, a bit like the first time round, when I did the first furlough scheme webinar, the guidance hasn't yet been announced. So we're going on what we know so far. It's due to be published on the 10th of November. We know that with the previous 2 furlough schemes, the focus was slightly different. First time round, it was very much about job retention. Second time round, it was more about impact of COVID. So it's going to be really interesting to see what the approach is going to be this time round and what the focus will be on. But we do know that you can claim even if the relevant employee hasn't used the scheme before, even if you as the employer haven't used the scheme before, you can claim. And from the 8 o'clock on the 11th of November is the first point at which you can claim for individuals who've been on furlough from the 1st of November. So as we've said, the furlough will continue to be flexible. So employees can continue to do some work some of the time and be furloughed some of the rest of the time. Employees, now we've noticed that they've reintroduced talking about employees being furloughed if they're shielding. I've seen some updated guidance in England around shielding, nothing specifically in Wales. I have seen that the Chief Medical Officer has written to anybody who is classed as extremely clinically vulnerable, offering them guidance. But because that information was sent prior to this furlough scheme being announced, it may be that guidance will be updated and that you can legitimately furlough people if they're shielding. Generally, the advice in the letter says that people should risk assess for themselves as to what's risky in terms of contact with other people and try to reduce that as much as possible. For you as employers, obviously you've always had that since the 1st of August, that responsibility to risk assess people who are clinically vulnerable and then decide whether for them, whether they should come back into work, whether you can put in place enough measures to keep them safe. But now, if it's saying you can furlough those individuals, then potentially they can be, because they're classed as clinically vulnerable, if they've had a letter from the Chief Medical Officer, then potentially you can furlough them under this scheme. It doesn't mean, of course, that they have to be furloughed. So I think this is more about, and I know of quite a few cases, obviously, in the last few months since August, people who haven't been able to come back to work on medical advice because of the risks around their individual conditions, and employers who haven't been able to put in place measures to keep people safe. And those people effectively have been on sick pay since that time. Potentially, they could be furloughed, is the way that it's looking. But let's see what the guidance says about that when it comes out. Now, employees that were employed and on the payroll from the 23rd, on the 23rd of September rather this year, and who have been made redundant already or have stopped working, can be re-employed and claimed for. I'm going to cover this in a bit more detail later, something that comes up quite regularly. And we'll cover it in a bit more detail later. So under what was the job support scheme, employees couldn't be under notice for redundancy and utilise the scheme. So one of the things that lots of employers, particularly small employers, find really useful with the furlough scheme was that they could put people on notice of redundancy, and part of that notice would be paid for by furlough. With the job support scheme, that wasn't going to be possible, which made the job support scheme a lot less attractive for lots of employers, and they would have had to fund a lot more of a redundancy cost. So this is, if you are going to make redundancies, potentially another opportunity to do that in a slightly more cost-effective way, unless the guidance tells us otherwise. But certainly at the moment, it's looking like that's going to be something we're going to be able to do again this time round. So moving to have a look at flexible furlough. So I'm not going to cover a lot on this because it's not too different, just the reminder really. Employees will be able to work part-time or being furloughed. For the hours that they don't work, they're classed as furloughed. For the hours that they do work, you have to pay them normal pay. For the hours effectively that they use is the way that it's termed in the guidance. And as far as we know, there's going to be no minimum furlough period. I know previously it had to be 7 days. That was then scrapped. We don't know until we see what the guidance says, but there's nothing to indicate at the moment there's going to be a minimum period. So let's have a look and see what comes back. So a bit, if we remember, people can come back part-time, so they can come back and work across the week a number of hours, or they can come back 1 week and be off another week. So you can rotate employees on and off, utilise it as flexibly as you can. Now, don't forget, if you're using flexible furlough, you will need to get agreement from employees on what they can and can't work if the flexibility differs from what they're normally contracted to do. So don't assume just because there's this ability to do this that you can just say to staff, okay, we're going to expect you to do something different because it works out better for us financially to do it this way. You are varying their contract, so it does need to be done with their agreement. And I would say preferably written agreement. There was lots of controversy over this, over one of the schemes where I think the government had suggested everything should be signed by employees. I think that a bit more flexibility has been brought in there, but certainly following up, if nothing else, in writing to them to confirm what's been agreed, giving them an opportunity to ask questions, giving them an opportunity and getting somewhere recorded, even if it's over email, them confirming that they accept these new terms. And I would also suggest, I think I'm going to cover this actually slightly later on, that you build in review dates if possible, because again, we don't know how the situation is going to change. You might want a degree more of flexibility rather than saying this is going to be the situation for the next 5 months or the next 3 months, even until the end of January. And also think about giving reasonable notice, because again, people hopefully will be as flexible as they can be, but if people have got other responsibilities, they might need notice just to rearrange those responsibilities. So not necessarily saying on a Thursday afternoon, right from Monday, I want you to work a completely different shift pattern, because that may not be reasonable. It may be that they can do it, but to give as much notice as possible. So what are employee rights under furlough? Well, this, again, as I said, this is useful just to remind people about these things, because I think some of them probably have been forgotten a bit because we've become a little bit more relaxed, I think. And employees have certainly, in lots of cases, been a lot more willing to change than perhaps they might have been previously. So as we've said, a written agreement there, and I'm going to cover that in a little bit more detail in another slide, and giving them some notice of changes and potentially building in a review date. So in the written agreement, as I said, they don't have to agree to be furloughed for less pay. So the government says 80%, but if your staff say, no, I'm not happy to be furloughed on 80%, actually I've been furloughed now for most of the year, I can't continue on 80%. You can't just force them to continue to stay on that at 80%. It does need to be with their consent and preferably in writing. I mean, the alternative, frankly, might be job losses, even their own job, but that doesn't mean that they have to agree to that reduction in pay or agree to a reduction in working hours when you're looking at rotating people possibly on flexible furlough. So as I've said, put in place a review date, give you then increased flexibility, and you're not tying yourself up and trying to forecast what might happen in the future. And if you can, say that people will be given X number of weeks notice of the change, even if that's only 1 week, because that's as much as you think you can legitimately give. And again, you know, if you're putting that up front, people are agreeing to that, then that's not unreasonable. It's just about trying to reach a form of employment effectively. And if you've got a short-term working clause, we've talked about this previously, and effectively that's what furlough is actually, it's a short-time working clause, then effectively you can utilise this anyway to say, we've got this clause, it says we can do this, but do check the wording and make sure that the clause is suitable for the situation that you're proposing. And just a reminder again that indirectly, an employee could potentially claim a redundancy payment if they've been laid off or put on short-term working. It is only triggered when they receive less than half a week's pay. So this situation shouldn't necessarily trigger that. But I am going to talk about alternatives to furlough. So that is just something to bear in mind. And accruing annual leave. So as I said already, people will accrue annual leave while they're on furlough. And annual leave is paid at 100%. So you can utilise the 80% furlough pay, but you do need to top up the 20% when you're paying for any days annual leave. And don't forget as well, you can instruct staff to take leave. So as long as you give them double the notice to the amount of leave to be taken. So 1 week's notice for 2 weeks, 1 week's leave, 2 weeks notice, or don't forget that they can carry the leave forward into 2021 and 2022, a maximum of 4 weeks across those 2 years. But you might want to review whether you want to manage that before it becomes a problem, or whether you do say, actually, we think we'll have enough flexibility in those years that we would prefer that they carry it forward, then maybe we have to make those payments now. And as I said, don't forget that you can claim furlough pay at the moment towards the annual leave. So it is a way of utilising furlough without having that cost to the organisation. And looking at training, same thing. If people are training, they should receive 100% pay. If someone's doing something for a couple of hours, then it may be neither here nor there. But I would say if they're doing at least a minimum of half a day, then that should be topped up to 100% pay. Some staff might need to keep in place registrations, qualifications, skills and knowledge. And this is actually a really good time, I've said it before, if people are not able to work for periods while they're furloughed, to get them to do some training, get their knowledge up to date in some areas. Just because they're at home doesn't necessarily mean that they can't be doing something that could benefit your organisation in the future. And don't forget, you've still got a duty of care to staff who are furloughed under the health and safety at work legislation. If they've got mental health difficulties, you've got a responsibility to them. of concerns over coronavirus, job security and whatnot. So you need to consider undertaking stress risk assessment with individuals and potentially signposting them to specialist support. I'm going to cover a little bit more of that off very briefly later. And communication. So it's not expressly a right that individuals have, but you want to keep them updated with any developments, just keep in touch with them while they're furloughed. It's just part of recognising, kind of keeping that connection, because you don't want to store problems up later on when people do come back, that they have a feeling necessarily that they were just kind of left to drift in the period where they were furloughed if they couldn't come into work. So just covering off what you might put in a written agreement with individuals, confirming their job title. You might put some details around their job description, where they're located, and particularly if that might change during this period, what their pay would be, what the hours will be, clarify holiday entitlement, and don't forget about putting in a review date if you're going to do that. Just a quick mention about remembering the good work plan. If you're putting a written agreement in the form of a contract, there's certain things you need to cover off since the good work plan legislation came in April. So just check that out. I'm not going to cover that off, obviously, in this session. I'm going to have a look at alternatives to furlough. For lots of people, these won't necessarily be alternatives, but it's just worth thinking about them in case they are. So agreeing to an unpaid career break or sabbatical might actually suit individual employees' personal circumstances to actually have a complete unpaid break from work, and that might suit you as well. Typically, the employment contract will be kept alive during that period, meaning that they would continue to accrue benefits and their continuous service would also be preserved. It may be an option that people would be interested in. You may lay individuals off temporarily without pay. I haven't really come across organisations doing that because of furlough, but you may be in a situation where even with furlough, you can't afford to keep people on and you do need to completely lay them off. If you do this, you could only really do it if you've got that contractual right within the contract, or you consult with staff to obtain their consent to be laid off. It's like with the other one, potentially it triggers a redundancy payment. So if you're going to do it, make sure you can afford to pay any redundancies if they do get triggered. Or you could implement a different form of short-time working. So not necessarily what the government has set out, but a different form that works better for you potentially. And it's a bit like the reducing hours and pay. You could actually look at a different reduction in hours and pay necessarily to what's being set out by the government. Again, it might be in order to keep their job. Individuals might prefer to do that, or they might even drive that themselves because of their individual circumstances at the moment. Lots of people with care and responsibilities or relatives who live in other places in the country might actually want to consider different options at the moment to be able to support other people in the country they wouldn't necessarily be doing in normal circumstances. But consultation if you're driving it, reaching an agreement even if they're driving it, and allowing employees to work elsewhere. So actually we're getting lots of requests about people wanting to work in other parts of the country because they're working remotely. That might be something that fits in with furlough anyway, or fits in with reducing hours anyway, but also looking at the possibility of secondment possibility. Somebody actually going, lots of people obviously have been doing this around the NHS, particularly in the beginning. People have been taking secondment from their current roles, going to work in the NHS because they've got NHS experience. So it might be a way of saving you some money when you haven't got any work and them going and working, but technically they still retain their contract with you. I'm just going to cover off now. I said to you about planning, thinking about, and I'm sure you're doing this anyway, but lots of organisations I think did get probably caught out a little bit first time round with not having done some business continuity planning work. So this is just about thinking ideally for life after furlough, but also just thinking about keeping up to date in case things happen, move very quickly. So obviously you're keeping up to date with the ever-changing landscape, making sure you're complying with legislation in order to protect your business, your clients, your staff. But I would just give a caveat to when you're doing that to only using official resources and keeping an eye out for updates, and then maybe letting staff know about these things as and when they happen. There's a lots of different information out there, and not all of it necessarily is as credible as other information. Make sure that you've got everybody's up-to-date contact numbers and emergency contact details in case anything occurs in work. You've got people that you can get hold of if something happens with a member of staff while they're in work. As I said, make sure that you're aware of what's the latest national and local advice, which has been really difficult to do at some times, particularly with different local lockdowns. If you've got people travelling into one area and or other areas, knowing exactly what's the local advice can be a bit more difficult. And checking about what your response is as an employer to any of that changing advice, making sure you're doing what you can do to protect people's health and reduce any risk of infection spreading, and continuing to communicate as the situation changes. Make sure that managers, if you've got managers in your organisations, they're clear on what relevant policies and processes are, because they're usually going to be the first point of contact for some of these questions, particularly if you want to have more flexibility, if things have continued to change. Remember that some policies may indirectly be seen as contractual, so wherever possible, don't introduce something different without discussing the impact of it on your staff first. Plan for a local outbreak. Think about what would you need to cover in terms of key staff, preparing in advance if, for example, you suddenly have a breakout within your own organisation. Have you got ways of continuing business? What would you do? So just kind of contingency planning on that basis. Managing mental health issues. I've mentioned that a couple of times, but obviously it's really, really prevalent at the moment. So it's something to be really hot on and conscious of. Be assessed the risk of stress-related ill health arising from work activities that some individuals might do, and think about any measures that you might put in place to control the risks. Talk to people about support that's available, and encourage people to talk about how they're feeling, so that people don't bottle this stuff up and then it becomes a much bigger problem later on. Think about transferable skills. Have you got enough people to keep business critical stuff running? If several co-workers are contacted by test and trace, for example, you might have gaps. Start training other people up for things that they might not be able to do the whole job, but they can jump in and do some aspects of it. And as I think I've probably already said, really, free training. There's loads of free training available online. I came across this the other day, the Skills Toolkit campaign, .gov.uk, and people can access free training to upskill in certain areas or just keep their skills up to date in certain areas through this. But there's a wealth of things that you might think industry specific. It would be great if people could just have a read over this stuff and help to have some new ideas ready for when we do get back to the new normal, hopefully in the future. So yeah, it's just kind of thinking ahead on that basis. Now, I mentioned well-being, so just a couple of Time for Change is a Mind initiative. It's about basically promoting, talking about mental health within the workplace. There's lots of different levels that you can do as an employer in terms of being involved with the initiative, but the very low level one is a nice sort of entry level, just making people aware that you're an employer that promotes positive mental health. Mind Cymru, lots of resources on their website, and Mental Health Wales, just a few there for you to have a look at if you're looking for any kind of areas to signpost people to, and some resources that you might find useful for yourselves. So, as I said, kind of planning for life after furlough, you could look at work workforce planning. What will you need from April next year? What do you do? What do you need to do to put this into place? Who can do it? Like we've already said. And if coronavirus has given you an opportunity to diversify, and it has for lots of organisations, think about how you can best use the time between now and then to take steps to make this happen. And think about whether you might consider, for example, engaging an apprentice, a low-cost way of diversifying your business. Somebody comes in, you can train with them in terms of this new area that you might want to develop in. It's a fairly low-cost way of doing it. Or think about the government Kickstart scheme, for example. Someone comes in for 6 months and is paid for the government, trained by you. So this could be a way of looking at your staffing and thinking, is there a slightly more cost-effective way that we can do things? Because we know we're not necessarily going to be able to keep hold of everybody that we've got. And in terms of changing your staffing altogether, you might want to have a look at alternative roles. Is there something that you want to spend this time training somebody to do differently, undertake a different role? And looking at whether those staff are interested in training in a slightly different area. So as we said, they can be trained while they're on furlough. You've only got to top up their pay, and you can utilise the scheme basically to do that over the next few months. And don't forget, if you are changing people's roles, it is classed as a change in contract, so you do still need their agreement to do it. But, again, it could be a suitable alternative role if you would potentially have to make them redundant otherwise. But that's obviously, you'd have to look at that in more detail if you were going to look at that in terms of redundancy terms. Secondments, we've already covered. It might be you've got a good relationship with one of your suppliers, for example. It would be great for them to have some training and job experience over there. They can bring that knowledge and information back to you. That might be an option. Or collaborate. Again, I've seen lots and lots of examples of this year. People working together, organisations that wouldn't have necessarily done that, either because they're working together from a client perspective, or even people much more utilising the skill sets of staff in one another's organisations, obviously with their agreements, and people even considering employing an individual between them. That can be slightly complex, but it is potentially an option to think about. And I talked about this previously, but changing terms and conditions. So as I've said previously, there hasn't really been a better time to do that. People have been more accepting of different terms and conditions that might be available because it's a way of keeping the business running, basically. But I think they're only likely to be accepted if there's a fair and transparent process, and it's not just picking some lower paid groups, for example, and changing their terms and conditions and potentially keeping everybody else's the same. You've got to think about discrimination if you're doing anything where you might be changing things for one group and not necessarily for another. So looking at not retaining staff, obviously a possibility is that you might be having to make redundancies. If you are going to do this, then make sure that you demonstrate you've done what you can to avoid making compulsory redundancies. This is part of demonstrating that you're following a fair process, and make sure you do follow a formal process if you are going to go through a redundancy process. And a formal process means planning ahead, because don't forget, if you have somebody with you, employed by you, who's been with you for 12 or more years, they're entitled to 12 weeks notice. So you're going to need more than that, 3 months effectively, to undertake your process and give them notice. So you really need to plan ahead if you do need to make redundancies. When you're costing it all, you've got to build all of that into your timescale and your costs. And while on the subject of redundancies, I'm going to address a point made as part of all of the furlough schemes, and obviously including the current one, which is to consider re-engaging people who have already been made redundant. So while it sounds like morally maybe the nice thing to do, if you do bring somebody back into employment, even if it is just for the period of furlough, you are engaging in a contractual relationship with them. And this means when furlough comes to an end, you need to find a way to legally end the contract. If you've already been through a redundancy process, potentially you could have to go through that process again to justify that that person should be the person who's made redundant. I mean, lots of people have done this with the previous scheme and lived to tell the tale. They've literally just brought people back in, put them on furlough, and once there became a cost to the organisation, they said to them, we're not going to support you anymore, and it's been absolutely fine. But there will be individuals who are struggling financially and potentially could challenge, have I been unfairly dismissed by you letting me go effectively through at the end of the furlough process. So just need to be aware of that. So moving on to the action plan, check if your employees are eligible for furlough, check that you're meeting your obligations to your employees who are under furlough, consider the alternative options for furlough and whether furlough is the right thing for you in the commercial sense of things, and conduct your business continuity planning because you don't know when you might need it, and conduct your workforce planning because you potentially might have a bit of breathing space to do that, and there might be a lot of benefit to that in the future. So we're going to move to questions. This, sorry, I always put this digital forms reminder in there, and I'm sure Lisa will do that again, however. But I'm now going to switch back on my camera, stop screen sharing, so we can cover the questions.
Okay, thanks, Leslie. Yeah, just a reminder to look out for the emails that will come through from me, please, to get the signatures back. But if anybody wants to come off their mic now and ask Leslie any questions, now's your time.
Did we have any questions through chat, Lisa?
No, there's nothing on the chat.
Okay, lovely.
I'm guessing you must have given all the info.
I've got a question.
Oh, there we go.
So if we got, so let's say we've got an apprentice that's working or a trainee, could we just put them onto furlough and then claim the furlough for them because you know they're training all the time? If they're a trainee, they're training.
Yeah, I mean, if they're under a contract effectively, then that contract, then they could be put on furlough in the same way as anybody else on the contract. What you might have to check with apprentices is sometimes they do have to undertake a certain level of training, or they may not satisfy the criteria to continue to be an apprentice. So you might need to review that and just check that they're either, I know in some cases, almost training has been put on hold. There's been an agreement that certain training providers don't have to continue to provide training. But certainly I'd have a look at that and just check that you're not contravening any other agreement that you've got in respect of that apprentice. Does that answer your question?
Okay, so what if we send them to college once a week? Is that day, would that day become under training, or can we claim that day back?
Yeah, I mean, I'm suggesting it would. Yes, it would. Yeah, it would have to, wouldn't it? So, in that case, then yeah, they'd go to. It'd be classed as like the same as a day in work, really, wouldn't it? To a degree, that's how they get paid.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Who else had a question?
Yes. Can I ask about responsibilities of people who are furloughed? Are they then restricted to sitting at home watching television because they're not meant to be working? Or can they volunteer for activities that are available to them? I'm thinking of mental health issues now. We employ quite a number of very young people who are living on their own, maybe in a caravan somewhere, and they are isolated and feeling that they can't actually go out to work anywhere because they're furloughed, but can they volunteer to do work elsewhere without jeopardising their furlough?
They can, yeah, they can, absolutely. I mean, this did change in the previous furlough. I think the very first scheme, there was no work. Then people were allowed to do some work, and I think partly because they were trying to encourage people to do work in the NHS at the time. And we don't know until this next set of guidance comes out whether it will definitely be people can or can't work, but definitely it will clarify people can volunteer.
Yeah.
As you say, you know, for mental health reasons, people need to be where they can, safely doing it, engage with other people where they can.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Who else had a question?
Can I ask a question? Yeah. Have you any idea when the guidance will be out? When are we expecting that?
Yeah, 10th of November, so next Tuesday, we're expecting the updated guidance.
Well, thank you.
Who else had a question? About furlough, it can be about anything else HR related. It's, you know, you've got a burning question about it at the moment.
Oh, you can have a early coffee this morning, Lesley, by the look of it. They're all starving, they want their lunch now.
Yeah, good point. We did think about that actually, didn't we, when we looked at the time, is it going to be over people's lunch break?
Yeah, whether it would, yeah, if anyone would come with it being so close to lunchtime. But
yeah, you can email if you have got questions you don't want to necessarily cover on the webinar, and we can have a look at those. Don't worry about that.
That's great. Thanks, Lesley, for giving up your time this morning, and for everybody who's attended. Yeah, lunchtime for everyone now. So have a good weekend. Last one in lockdown, hopefully before Christmas. So have a good one. Thanks for coming. Thanks, Lesley. Thanks.
Thanks,
Bye.
Lesley.
Bye.
Right.